Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guests today are the authors of this book, Science and the Good, The Tragic Quest for the Foundations of Morality, James Davidson Hunter and Paul Nedelisky. Before I introduce them, our sponsor of the podcast is the Great Courses Plus app. You just touch on the app, you open it up like that. The app is free, of course, and you can access hundreds and hundreds of courses from the Great Courses catalog, each of which has a dozen to 24 different lectures, each of which is about 30 minutes long. And you can skip around with a subscription. You can pick and choose any of the courses or any of the lectures from any of the courses. You can stop them, go back. They keep track of where you were in each particular lecture. And it's a great deal. So if you access it through my podcast, you go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer, Shermer. You get a free trial plus $30 off the annual subscription. And so it comes out to a great deal. It's like the equivalent of a couple of Starbucks coffees a month. It's really a great deal for online content. I picked one here as an example, The Great Ideas of Philosophy by Professor Daniel N. Robinson. I picked this one because that's what we're going to be talking about on the podcast today. But just to give you an idea, this particular course, wow, this is huge. 60 lectures, each of which is about 30 minutes long. You can grind them out in about 20 minutes each if you listen to them at a slightly higher speed like I do at 1.2 speed. Oh, question number 60, God, really? I mean, lecture number 60 is on God really as a question. That's interesting because that ends up being this topic of today's podcast. Again, before I describe that, you go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer to get your free trial and discount on that. Be sure and do that because it's a great source for online content. Okay, this conversation took an interesting turn. I had no idea these two professional philosophers who wrote this book are also theists. I was interested in the book because I was asked to review it for a journal, which I did. I loved the book. I thought it was great. And they addressed my own arguments, along with those of Steven Pinker and Sam Harris, as we make the arguments that human flourishing as a basis for moral values, you can build an entire rational, scientific-based system of morality. They disagree with that. But they disagree with it on purely rational, empirical grounds. I had no idea that they were theists. So once I discovered that, the conversation took an interesting turn, and we end up talking about all the great topics of morality in the context of a theistic worldview. Now, they agree with me that divine command theory is flawed for all the reasons I talk about in The Moral Arc, and Pinker talks about in Enlightenment Now, and Sam talks about in his the book The Moral Landscape. And so they agree with us on that, but they have other perspectives on a theistic worldview that is very interesting. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. This is one of the best I've had. So with that, please give a listen to this conversation with James Davidson Hunter and Paul Nedelisky and myself. Your new book is Science and the Good, The Tragic Quest for the Foundations of Morality, Yale University Press. We'll put a link in the description so people can order the book and read it. I highly recommend it. I think it is, as I said in my review, the best single volume that kind of outlines the problems to be solved. Now, for the purpose of our conversation, let's just assume no one's read my review of your book, your response to my review, or the book. And because most of the people listening, they won't know that much about this subject, but of course we'll find it super important and interesting because it is. So by way of introduction, you give us kind of an outline of what the problem is we're all trying to solve and why you think you had that sort of three different levels of how science can inform moral issues. So maybe whichever one of you wants to kind of give a brief outline of your argument there.
I'll jump in historically, and then why don't you jump in after I set the context. The central problem is the question of what are the foundations of human flourishing. Historically, this was a question that was essentially addressed by hegemonic religious authorities and hegemonic religious cultures but in Western Europe, as with the emergence of the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, the wars of religion that followed, there was a general consensus, at least on the part of a certain group of intellectuals, that we would not find a universal foundation for religion, for human flourishing in religion, and we needed to solve this problem because the violence that human beings were doing to each other was simply promiscuous. It was disruptive to the social order, and it was absolutely brutalizing. And the idea emerged in this context that perhaps science could do for morality what it was already beginning to do for biology, for chemistry, for physics, and that is to find essentially a universally applicable foundation for the moral order. Now, it's significant that many of the most important figures in the early quest, in the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th century, were not only moral philosophers, but they were also political philosophers. They understood that at the foundation of any political order, any just and humane political order, was a morality and a consensus around certain kinds of moral understandings. And so to crack that nut, to solve that problem of discovering a universally applicable a consensus around the nature of moral truth, the nature of the good, one could build a political and social order that, in fact, would present the conditions for human flourishing. So that's where the quest began, and it's a quest that has undulated in terms of its interests, in the sense of in the hope and the possibility that this is a nut that could be cracked. But in the 20th century, the quest flagged for a number of decades until recent times. And in the early mid-1960s into the early 70s, there was a renewed interest that maybe with new technologies, new syntheses of philosophical ideas, that we could return to this quest and maybe actually find the foundations for morality, scientific foundations for morality, where other efforts had failed. Paul, why don't you jump in at this point?
Yeah, the way I see it, the question that has animated the project from the beginning, from the early modern origins that James just described, in a nutshell, it's the same problem we face today. It's the problem of pluralism. On the one hand, it's great that we don't have some sort of hegemonic system that forces us all to toe the line on a particular view of the world. But the flip side of that is, well, okay, how do we agree with each other? And we're not maybe killing each other quite as brutally as we were in the wars of religion, but there's still a lot of polarization and disagreement today. So the question is still with us, and there hasn't appeared a new knight in shining armor besides science in the last 400 years that could have a shot at resolving the problem. So as James described, when after a scientific approach to morality sort of re-emerged onto the scene in the 70s with sociobiology down to present, as evolutionary psychology, a whole new host of approaches took up the standard again, attempting to do what what was being attempted in the modern era into the 19th century. And I don't know how far you want us to go. Should we go through the whole book, or just
that's
kind of the problem in a nutshell?
Yeah, I think that's right. Let me just see if I can summarize it. I think historically what you're talking about is the Enlightenment program of what David Hume called the science of man. We have a Newtonian mechanical universe that seems to work pretty well in terms of making predictions. And then the chemical world and the biological world. Why can't we apply these to the social world? Maybe the social world is something like a machine. The economy runs like a machine. The political system could be like a machine. If we can tease out the causal vectors, and then we can make predictions and then design a society that's going to be, ideally structured to avoid the problem of the 30 Years' War and religious wars and witch crazes and things like that. Now, that's a kind of a social level. Of course, we're also interested in what can I personally do to lead a more moral life, a better life. How do I know what's right and wrong personally? And of course, we're on agreement that divine command theory is not going to hold water for philosophers like yourself or scientists like myself. We reject that, but can we do better than that? Well, yes, we have science and philosophy. But as you point out in the book, there are some certain flaws with that. So maybe let's start with a distinction between philosophy and science, because, of course, when I say science can help inform these things or maybe even determine values, I'm not thinking, we're going to go down to the paleontology department and ask the paleontologist what's the right thing to do on the abortion issue or whatever. I just mean, when I say science, I mean kind of all of human learning, philosophy, science, reason, rationality, empiricism, logic. Just put the whole package together. Can we kind of try to answer some questions there? So from there, maybe, Paul, pick up, you had those three different levels. There's science trying to explain why we act morally or immorally, why we feel shame or guilt or pride, or why we're vengeful or jealous. That's one thing, but that's completely different than what should I personally do in this particular, what's the right thing to do, or what should society decide to do about this particular problem, regardless of its origins, evolutionary origins, or its culture or whatever.
Right. Well, let me just say at the outset, I agree with your sort of big tent approach. Maybe science, like lowercase s science or something like that, just rational engagement with reality. Because you're right. We if we think there are right things and wrong things to do, we want to be right about that. And so that's a question for what the world is like, and we have to bring all relevant knowledge to bear on that question. It's a further question of what role exactly does empirical science and demonstration play that we can get into. But the three levels, So when James and I were working on the book, we realized, well, it's not as though narrowly empirical science can't say anything about morality. Surely it can. I mean, there has to be some connection between the moral realm and the empirical realm, because we have empirical bodies and we do things and for moral reasons, and so there is some kind of nexus. But at the same time, it seemed to us at the outset, at least, that there are some of the deepest, most important questions about morality. They don't seem to be the sorts of things that science, at least empirical science, can tell us about. It's just the phenomenon isn't the sort of thing you can get purchase on empirically. And so we said, well, let's try to partition these different levels out. And so we called level one, that's the gold standard. That's if there was a way that we could do through empirical demonstration, some kind of test or experiment that would objectively tell people, this is the right thing to do, this is the wrong thing to do. Here's a moral law. Here's what the good consists in such a way that, like for so many scientific issues, the disagreement could be resolved. That would be a level one result. One click down from there, level two, we realized, well, maybe science can't directly show us the good or the evil, but maybe it can tell us things that are so relevant that it helps us, by doing a little bit of logic or philosophy, resolve some of the big questions about morality. And maybe it could tell us that virtue theory is false or something like that. That would be a big advance. We could take off one of the three main views, and that would be great. And then finally, level three is results from science that don't really bear on the truth or falsity of any moral system or any moral claim, but they do tell us, like you were saying, about the hardware that we have that enables us to think about morality, and or maybe how our moral sense may have developed. A lot of the questions that are dealt with in evolutionary psychology would be at this level. They don't tell us what's right or wrong, but they can maybe, if successful, tell us how we came to be the kinds of beings that can know these things.
Yeah, so there, maybe just give a couple examples, because I think we're in agreement on that also, and we can then work our way up from there at that level 3. That is, say you start with the selfish gene model. It's fully explainable why I would want as much stuff as I can get for myself. But I, knowing that you feel the same way, you and I have to come to some sort of agreement. Like, I'm not going to just selfishly hoard everything, and neither are you. We're going to share. So we have something like reciprocal altruism. I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. And then we expand the moral sphere to include everybody outside of our personal families, to include the local community and our kin and kind, and so on. And maybe we throw some potlatches for the other group across the river. And then so we learn to trust them and they learn to trust us. And so we build a moral system there. And you can sort of build that from a kind of Dawkins level selfish gene all the way up to, at least that level circle. Once you get to nation states and so on, it's much harder to get there. But that we can kind of understand: reciprocity, reciprocal altruism, kin selection, and all that. We've done pretty well, I think, at that level of explaining, why we're good or bad, and why people, and all the other areas of moral emotions, why people get jealous and make guard, or why people take up self-help justice when the criminal justice system doesn't work, because we have an impulse to want justice and fairness in society. And particularly now with the BLM movement, where clearly the criminal justice system is not fair to African Americans, particularly in inner cities. They naturally want to take justice into their own hands, because we have an innate sense of right and wrong. So there, I think we're in fairly solid ground. And the question is, how do you go up from there to level 2? So James, maybe you want to pick up there what the problem is there.
Yeah, I think we are agreed on the possibilities of level 3. I'm going to let Paul address the issue of level 2. This was actually a section that Paul addressed, took the point in the book. But even on level 3, just to push back a little bit, we absolutely agree on the possibilities of level 3 application of science to morality. But it seems to me the conclusions that we draw, we should be careful about being premature about what conclusions we can draw from our descriptions. I mean, as a historical sociologist and sociologist of knowledge, there's a way in which it seems that the conclusions you are pointing to, that seem fairly common sense to us as upper middle class academics comfortably situated in universities, can say that this is the natural evolve. It feels to me like an ex post facto rationalization for conclusions that we are already comfortable with, but in a world that remains fairly Hobbesian. So I think we do agree on the potential of level 3 descriptions moving the conversation forward. My sense is that we are not as far along as you might think we are.
Yeah, well, okay.
For example, let's reciprocal altruism.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, yeah. I mean, I agree with James. Part of the the story you just told, Michael, about kind of broad strokes. Here's an evolutionary story of how peaceful coexistence or social life amongst humans, could develop. I think that's right. That the hard thing for me is to see how we make the jump from people living together, human beings living together without killing each other, to anything distinctively moral or ethical. the story you told could hold for hundreds and hundreds of different species of animal. That I would think, we would be hesitant to say, oh well, there's any morality involved. There are various pressures on the survival and transmission of the species that work out in certain ways, and so sometimes that permits sort of social arrangements. At one end you have certain kinds of ants, really complex, dense societies, and some animals that based on what it takes for them to survive as a species, they're more solitary loners. But in whatever case, it's not clear that just finding a way of coexisting peacefully is enough to say, and that's good, and that's moral, and that's right. And that's the bridge that I can't quite see how to get across just from looking at sort of the evolutionary developmental story at the level of just science by itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So again, just thinking along the lines of moral emotions like guilt. So clearly, people in different cultures feel guilty about different things, and the culture kind of decides that based on the norms and customs of their traditions. But what I'm asking is, why would anybody feel guilty about anything? What's the purpose of having a moral emotion where you get a squirt of some hormone or other from your hypothalamus, and that affects your neural networks and makes you feel guilty, and then you express your guilt to the people you've harmed, and so hopefully they forgive you, and there's some kind of interaction there. What hopefully we're trying to do with evolutionary ethics is kind of find a basis for that. There's kind of an evolutionary logic. It's not just humans. I mean, Franz de Waal, as you know, because you wrote about him in your book, it talks about this going on with primate politics. You have the alpha male and the beta males, and they compete, and then the females do this and that. And there's kind of a logic to how those things unfold based on evolution and culture.
At this point, and I'm always open to revising my views, but at this point, I'm not confident that we're going to be able to have a scientific explanation for moral emotions like guilt. It's my view until I see reason to change it would be that the moral realm is sort of an autonomous realm unto itself. You can't really understand it in terms outside of its own sphere. It's sort of like the colors. If you can't really explain to a blind person or a colorblind person what certain colors are like, they have to experience it. It's an inherent logic to this domain of reality. And so, what is guilt for? Why do human beings experience guilt? I have not seen a purely naturalistic evolutionary explanation that seemed to come close. I'm interested to see if there could be such a thing, but it seems to me that the best answers would have to come from another realm, something about the inherent nature of human beings as moral beings, where so much of our life is bound up in living with other people and respecting their dignity and their worth, and strangely, mysteriously, having the cognitive wherewithal to understand these things and know about them and engage in these ways. I don't think that the naturalistic program has come close to giving an account of how that could have arisen. So this is part of why I think it needs to be supplemented, that we have to be able to appeal to something besides sort of purely disenchanted accounts of human development to account for these sorts of phenomena.
It would be,
but I could change my mind.
A fairly minimalist science that would demonstrate that moral guilt is something that's universal across different cultures at different times. Seems to me that is an empirical question that we could discover, but it's the variation of the causes of guilt, of what people feel guilty over, that is the interesting scientific question from my vantage. It is accounting for variability, and not just the differences, but also levels of intensity and its consequences.
Sure. So some cultures say polygamy is the norm, and therefore men would not feel guilty about having multiple sexual partners at the same time. Of course, you rarely hear how the women feel about these things, but maybe that's another issue. Whereas in, say, a Western culture, we would feel guilty if we were caught having multiple sexual partners when the norm is you're not supposed to do that. But again, so but the idea has below that is some sort of social harmony so people can get along, in which if you have psychopaths, this 1 to 3%, depending on who's doing the counting, of psychopaths in a society who don't seem to feel guilty about violating norms. They don't give a crap. They're going to do whatever they do. And now most of them are not criminals, but it's easier to become a criminal this way because you could just engage in criminal activity without feeling guilty about it. So like in Christopher Boehm's book, The Moral Origins, he makes an argument along this lines that in these hunter-gatherer groups, where modern hunter-gatherer groups, he has a database on this, where free riders and bullies and what we would call psychopaths, the people that just don't follow the norms, they have a whole series of sanctions against them to pull them in, to get them in line, because their behavior is so disruptive to the group. And they gossip about them, they talk to them, they scold them, they yell at them, they punish them to whatever extent they can in the group. And ultimately, if the guy is a really badass bully and just is so disruptive, they practice capital punishment. They take this guy out on a hike, on a hunting trip, and they come back without him. And if the guy's a big bully guy, he's massive. It's hard to kill somebody without modern weapons. So they all, you have like a dozen of these guys gang up on him. So Christopher Boehm's argument is that this evolved as a mechanism for social harmony. And now, of course, the question is, why haven't we gotten rid of 100% of the psychopaths? And the answer is that would take too much energy to do. That would be itself disruptive. So you have to just allow some of them to kind of thrive just a little bit. But beyond that 1 to 3%, it would just be so disruptive, the group itself would not survive. That's the argument that they make.
Is the idea that so I'm just not quite getting, where does the connection then come with guilt? Is it that
that they don't have they don't have a sense of guilt, and that they're not responding to the normal? I mean, most of us would feel embarrassed if we knew that the gossip was about us and how unfair, disruptive, or nasty, or selfish, or greedy, dishonest we are. So, we all have a kind of a sense of reputation protection. I want my reputation to be good. I want you to like me. I want you to think of me as an honest person. And when I hear that you don't, if I feel normal shame and guilt, I think, ooh, boy, I better change my ways because this doesn't feel good.
Yeah. And so it's the thought that we've sort of winnowed out. We tend to winnow out the psychopaths. And so what's left over, and the people the individuals who pass on their genes are those who can feel guilt until it's very common. Is that
that's the argument? Yeah.
Okay. That seems plausible to me. I mean, I think that my question would be, and I don't want to impose my questions on everyone, but the question I would have would be, but how did we? There's guilt that connects with moral phenomena, because you did something bad, and you could conceivably, have emotions that are like guilt in some way that you have just because they conduce to the survival of the species. And my question is always, how do we get those to marry up? How could it would just be a tremendous accident if the feelings and emotions that we have because they help us survive happen to map perfectly on to this realm of right and wrong and good and bad, unless you just reduce the moral realm to those emotions that helped us survive socially from an evolutionary perspective. Does that make sense? It's the difficult part of the project to me, in my opinion.
Well, what is your explanation for the origins of the moral sense?
Well, I don't have it worked out in detail. I mean, I'm a theist, broadly speaking, and so I think we human beings are like a personal God, and to some extent. What method did he use or she or it use to bring us about? Open questions. But this is, I think, the big challenge for the naturalistic program is how to account for all these distinctively human capacities that don't seem to lend themselves to the naturalistic evolutionary story very well. And knowledge of morality is one of them.
Oh, how interesting. I had no idea you were a theist. Okay, so I prematurely dismissed the divine. Oh, go ahead, James.
I was just going to say, I don't have a problem with your account of the evolutionary development of guilt, of the use of social control to weed out difficult actors in the social order. I think that's entirely plausible, but it seems to me that it's very difficult, first of all, to prove that the evolutionary. It could be, following. Let's say a theistic or let's say a Platonic view that human beings are simply wired this way, that we are that the human condition generally orients people, disposes people toward safety, toward some security, and it seems to me that science could probably establish the universality of those kinds of dispositions, even across cultures. I still don't think that gets us very far. And it doesn't necessarily tell us across that diversity what is the right way to find security, who constitutes a sociopath, and therefore worthy of being disciplined, controlled, pushed out from the protections of the social order. Again, it's plausible, but it's minimalist, and it doesn't get us very far.
By the way, James, are you also a theist? I didn't even ask or think about it.
Yes, I am. Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah. Okay. This is super interesting.
I should say we're definitely beyond the ambit of our book here.
I know it's okay. I know this is okay because to your credit, this never came up in your book. So I mean, your book is entirely based on reason and arguments, and that's great. But since I've got you, maybe I prematurely dismissed the divine command theory. So if you think that we are made in the image of God in some way, or that God gave us a moral sense, is that your argument? And my question would then be, well, how did he do that, or whatever? Yeah, I mean, did God build in some neural networks that are related to the sense of guilt and shame about violating norms because we shouldn't hurt other people, or a sense of love and comradeship with our fellow man, that kind of thing?
So just to say up front, James and I have never talked about this, so I have no idea what he's going to say.
Okay.
But for my part, I think something like that would have to be true. In terms of divine command theory, I don't think divine command theory is correct for the reasons you alluded to in your review of our book. The classic objections, I think, are basically right. Nothing can be good or bad just because someone says it. How is that supposed to work? But the classic monotheistic response to the Euthyphro problem, the kind of the standard objection to linking up morality and ethics to God. The standard way of getting around that is to say, well, the view is that God created everything besides God, and all positive features of reality exist in some way by participating in the divine being. I'm sure you've heard this kind of talk before. It's throughout Platonic thought and medieval thought and plenty of contemporary thought as well. And so the view would be that the goodness that's inherent in the world, and especially inherent in human beings, that is sort of on donation from a divine being. And so there is a connection, but it's not because anybody says this or that is wrong. It's because on this view, the view would be God is good, and God shares the goodness with human beings. This is the part of the source of human dignity and worth. And So there's a connection, but crucially, and I'll wrap up my little speech here. You don't have to believe in God to recognize that. In the same way that, even if you're a theist like myself, and you think, well, ultimately, if you trace back the story enough, the natural world comes from a creator. You don't have to believe that to recognize the reality of the natural world, to learn about trees, to learn about human beings. And so I think that's why you don't have to believe in God to know quite a lot about goodness and ethics and morality, because there are other ways to experience it.
Interesting, James.
It's really interesting to hear you on this. We should talk about this sometime.
Hey guys, this is your next book.
Yeah. Well, I in a similar way to my views of science and what's possible with regard to a science of morality, I would say the same thing about what many philosophers and theologians call the natural law. There are strong views of the natural law and weaker views of the natural law. And the stronger views would say that society should be ordered in such and such a way, that certain behaviors are obviously right, obviously wrong. And that may be true with regard to things like murder or the torture of children and the like. But it's not a comprehensive rule book for how, some views of the stronger view of natural law would say that it is fairly comprehensive how society should be ordered. I, at best, take a minimalist view of the natural law. If human beings are oriented toward the good, or toward, say, safety or beauty or love, these are dispositions and capacities that are not well developed in human beings. They are perhaps more potentialities than they are fully developed capacities. And again, I don't think that's incompatible with a more empiricist and even evolutionary view of human beings. I would say that as a theist, I would say that that human beings made in the image of God are made in ways that make us not divine in our, let's just say, it makes us divine in our potentialities, and not in our the empirical demonstration. We are social creatures, not necessarily all the way down, but fairly far down.
So, if I understand you, James, I think I'm reading this correctly, that we are far from being fairly good moral beings from birth, by nature. And therefore, we need religion. You need some kind of moral upbringing from parents, society, culture, religion, wherever it comes from, because we're more Hobbesian. We're more Hobbesian, that is, by nature. I mean, this is kind of the argument I'm making. See, to me, I think evolutionary psychology maps on fairly well with the conservative Christian. Maybe that's too narrow. Kind of the theists' perspective of human nature. And so when Christians talk about original sin or whatever, it's too broad a category and a word. I think we got to drill down. Well, what do you mean? Well, people are, they tend to lie and cheat, and if they can get away with it. So we need some kind of structure over that to bring up kids in a moral family and bring it, and people live in a culture where there are norms and customs that are enforced. Because if we don't enforce them, if we don't have a rule of law, we're back to Hobbes's nasty, brutish, and short society. So we have a social contract and so on. To me, when you say, well, God did it, or divine command, whatever, it feels like there's a move there, kind of like and then magic happens. And then somehow God put in us a sense of guilt or something. And to which I say, hang on for a second, that move right there, that's where I want to drill down and say, well, what exactly is going on in there? So to me, one of the arguments I make with the evolutionary ethics is to conservatives and Christians saying, this is actually pretty close to what you guys think. And liberals, if anything, have this more Rousseauian view that we're good by nature, and therefore we don't need all this religion. And so I don't think they get it right in that direction.
So let me just put it this way: that we may have more agreement than we might have assumed at the beginning of this conversation, but it's, my take is that the question of evolution is not interesting for me personally, insofar as it's an attempt to explain what we have in common with other species. The interesting evolutionary question to me is, why is it that human beings are so different from other species? And I take the view of the school of thought that came out of Germany in the early part of the 20th century called philosophical anthropology, that part of what makes us distinct from other species is that we are instinctually deprived. Unlike ducks that know how to swim and fly, or fish that know how to swim in schools, human beings weren't born with a well-developed instinctual apparatus that guides our behavior, that guides our thought, and guides our movement and behavior with creatures like our own. We are instinctually deprived or underdeveloped. The patterns of behavior that constitute social life and that ultimately constitute individual life have to be learned, and they are learned by sharing. And this is, in fact, what culture is. Culture provides. Culture, in its repeated institutional form, provides what for human beings what instincts provide for other creatures. So, for me, the issue of culture matters decisively. There is no outside of culture for human beings, and so thinking of science and morality in terms of what is individually appropriate, it's an interesting question, but the collective is much more important and I think interesting. It allows us to do the kind of comparative work that science excels at.
Yes, well, culture, though, and learning has to happen on some kind of structure, namely a brain, which evolved as an organ for certain purposes. So you're going to get a blend somehow of nature and nurture, both, clearly. But I take your argument that
it's going to be evolved, but it's also going to be formed in the context of early childhood development by particular parents in a particular historical moment who are living within a particular culture. All those kinds of things are interactive, and that's part of the nature-nurture equation as well.
Yeah, so there...
Michael, can I...
Yeah, please.
I wanted to go back. You made the argument about, and then the magic happens. That argument. I think that's actually, I think it's a good way to look at the explanatory conundrum that faces us, because this is a place where, from my perspective, we have to step back and look at what are the kind of available big picture explanations that are on offer. And one of them, I keep talking about naturalism. I don't know if that's a term you use or like. By that I mean the view that says whatever's real is ultimately explainable in terms that science can understand. It goes by different names in different places, but to me, that's one of the two or three main contenders for overall, explanatory views of the world today. And on that view, there's also this sort of magic problem, because I haven't seen anything close to a good explanation for how we take that final jump from peaceable social life as a group to actually understanding what morality is about. I mean, when you feel guilt, maybe sometimes it's misplaced, but sometimes we would say it's not misplaced. If I speak cruelly to someone in my family and then later feel guilt, it seems to me what's happening is it's this intrinsically moral phenomenon where I have wronged another human being who's valuable and who has rights and whose agency and autonomy I haven't respected, and somehow I have cognitive apparatus that lets me engage with that and recognize what I've done. And I think to be faithful to the phenomenon of morality, we can't erase that level of description of what's happening. And what I still haven't been able to find is a purely naturalistic evolutionary account that is able to connect up with that story. Inevitably, in the accounts that I see, the reason we have moral emotions ties back to the survival of the species. It doesn't respect the actual telos and nature of moral thinking and moral experience. It's, if that is the true account of where our moral emotions came from, we're being systematically deceived. And that's what I can't accept. I think, if I'm honest about what the moral life is like, it really is because these other individuals are valuable humans who I can't treat any way I like and who can't treat me any way they like. Certain rights are genuine, and we have genuine obligations and duties.
But why? What's your answer to the why question?
For me, the answer would be there's something fantastic about being able to experience the world at this level. It's in a way that we have no reason to think that ants can, for instance. Maybe killer whales, maybe some dogs, but most creatures can't engage the world at this level. We on a certain kind of theistic picture, we are like God at this level. We can there are colors we can see that other creatures cannot see, and what is the value in this? This is where explanations end. The value in being aware of the good is being aware of the good. It's an intrinsic good.
Yeah, that's where explanations end. Yeah, see, it's true.
You have to end.
Yes, at some point, but I think you're drawing the line too soon. I will grant that what humans do in terms of morality is qualitatively different than any other animals. Like, I think of Frans de Waal's work and other ethologists as describing pre-moral sentiments, in as much as even apes, gorillas, chimps, and so on, as interesting as their little political systems are and how they resolve conflict, and the defeated male comes over and bows down, and the female comes over and they make nice, and everything resolved for social order. That's nothing like what we do in terms of the complexity, particularly having language. So I'll grant you that. But at some point, to me, it's unsatisfying to just say, well, and that's just the way it is. You have to stop the causal chain somewhere. Why not look to these? And if you don't like evolution that much, just don't call it anything. We're looking for a natural explanation, in the same way that Newton was not a threat to the theistic worldview. He himself was something of a theist, probably a deist, but that he's explaining this is how the system that God created works. He created gravity, the laws of nature that then describe how solar systems are formed and so on. And Darwin made this point also in the second edition of The Origin of Species, because he was getting pushback from theists. And he said, why is everybody upset about this? Although he knew perfectly well why they were. And then he invoked Leibniz and Newton, saying back in their day, some theists were concerned. And then the response was, well, this is the way God does it. He uses gravity. So why not, Darwin argued, so many words, much better than I can say it now, that, God used natural selection to create the diversity of life. That's the laws of nature that God set up in the first place. Now, Darwin ended up being kind of an agnostic, not a theist, but his point was that why can't you just accept a naturalistic worldview? This is how God did it, so let's drill down and figure out how that happens, because it's so interesting.
I mean, I would be happy to. I mean, because I think that in some cases, naturalistic explanations do work. Celestial mechanics. I don't think, I don't see any need to appeal to anything supernatural in that case, at least not directly. But from where I sit, there are too many things like morality, and that they don't appear to be explicable in naturalistic terms. And morality is one thing, but the phenomenon of beauty, consciousness, free will, knowledge of mathematics, especially higher math, it's very tough to see how that that to get a satisfying story for how we have that capacity from a purely naturalistic evolutionary story. I mean, to me, it's clear that evolution occurred. It's undeniable. The problem for me is not that it leaves God out of the story. The problem for me is I don't see any way that by sticking with a purely naturalistic account, you can explain these other things that we are aware of in the world on the list I just gave.
Well, I would also say that a naturalistic account should include anthropology and sociology. And in this discourse on the science of morality, those fields are often, I wouldn't say they're excluded, but they're not a prominent part of the discussion. So we end up with evolutionary psychology. We end up with studies of the brain. We make all sorts of suppositions. But again, to me, the heart of science is its capacity to compare. Comparative analysis is critical, and there you just get you just have to be to move to anthropology and sociology in order to understand the differences. I mean, part of the problem we see in the contemporary science of morality is so much of the empirical work is done on 25, 18-year-olds who are mostly white and in elite colleges, and all sorts of grand conclusions are made on the basis of that, as though there's universality. This is, again, from a purely scientific and naturalistic point of view, insane. It's a data point, and all data points are useful.
Yeah, it's certainly a fair criticism, and that book, Weird, what's it called? Weird, the weirdest people in the world. And I had the author on the podcast, and yes, of course, we have to look at other cultures and so on. But here I would invoke Donald Brown, the anthropologist, since you brought up anthropology, and he has a whole book on human universals, a list of 373 characteristics of humanity that are common in every group studied. And I counted 202, 54%, that are related to moral and religious universals. Here's just a few. This is from my book, The Science of Good and Evil. Some moral psychological traits or sentiments include affection expressed and felt. Those are his words. Necessary for altruism and cooperation to be reinforced. Attachment, coyness display, crying, emotions, empathy, envy, fears, generosity, admired. Incest between mother and son, unthinkable or taboo. Judging others, pride, self-control, sexual jealousy, shame, sexual modesty, mourning of the loss, and it just goes on for pages. So here the idea would be that, well, if they're universal, then they're part of our nature. That's human nature. That's who we are. And culture then tunes them up and down, and the nasty, the inner demons. This is Hobbes's social contract. We got to have some kind of social contract in society, or else the demons will come out. But we have our better angels, so let's bump those up and squelch the other ones.
I don't disagree with that.
Yeah. I have not heard of that book. That's fascinating to me.
What's the name of the book?
Okay, so let me get the reference here for you. Let's see if I have it. Yes, so it's Donald Brown, 1991, Human Universals, McGraw-Hill. I don't know who publishes it now. I'm sure it's still in print. I see it cited all the time in evolutionary ethics and evolutionary psychology circles. But Paul, let me make another stab at it. And this is from my review of your book, and then so you know this already, but our listeners won't know this. So, so here's how the argument I make, and then I invoke Pinker, and then I'll throw Sam Harris into it, and then we can, because you criticize all three of us, so then I'll let you guys take a stab at that. So, this is me speaking now. It is my hypothesis that in the same way that Galileo and Newton discovered physical laws and principles about the natural world that are really out there, so too have social scientists discovered moral laws and principles about human nature and society that really do exist. And here, James, I would include definitely anthropology, sociology, and so on, especially those. Just as it was inevitable that the astronomer Johannes Kepler would discover planets that have elliptical orbits, given that he was making accurate astronomical measurements, and given that planets really do travel in elliptical orbits, he could hardly have discovered anything else. Scientists studying political, economic, social, and moral subjects will discover certain things that are true in these fields of inquiry. For example, that democracies are better than autocracies, that market economies are superior to command economies, that torture and the death penalty do not curb crime, that burning women as witches is a fallacious idea, that women are not too weak and emotional to run companies or countries, and most poignantly here, that blacks do not like being enslaved and that Jews do not want to be exterminated. And then I invoke Pinker, who actually thinks of these as possible like Platonic truths that we discover. On this analogy, Pinker speaking now, we are born with a rudimentary concept of number, but as soon as we build on it with formal mathematical reasoning, the nature of mathematical reality forces us to discover some truths and not others. No one who understands the concept of 2, the concept of 4, and the concept of addition can come to any conclusion but that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Perhaps we're born with a rudimentary moral sense, and as soon as we build on it with moral reasoning, the nature of moral reality forces us to some conclusions but not others. And then he gives an example. If I appeal to you to do anything that affects me, to get off my foot or tell me the time or not run me over with your car, I can't do it in a way that privileges my interest over yours, say retaining my right to run you over with my car, if I want you to take me seriously. Unless I'm a galactic overlord, or a theist or a god or whatever, I have to state my case in a way that would force me to treat you in kind. I can't act as if my interests are special just because I'm me and you're not, any more than I can persuade you that the spot I'm standing on is a special place in the universe just because I happen to be standing on it. So, and as you know, Sam makes something of a similar argument about, his thought experiment with the worst possible suffering anybody can conceive of. And then if you move away from the left wall of maximum suffering, and then as soon as you get away from that, you realize, well, we have to help assuage other people's suffering and so on if we want them to take us seriously. And now we have the basis of a moral system. So go ahead and take a whack at that.
Two thoughts initially. So one is there's a current in that line of thought that I think is exactly right, and that is there's an objective right and wrong, at least for some things. That thinking that that's the case is totally compatible with thinking that there isn't a science of morality, because it may be that the way we know the objective right and wrong, if and when we can know it, doesn't come through empirical observation, as it in fact does not. But I agree. I think people can know, at least in some cases, what's right and wrong, good and bad, and I think many people have at various times and places. The trouble in the bigger context of the argument and the story that James in my book engages is whether these recognitions of objective moral truth can occur in such a way they can persuade a lot of other people and resolve the disagreements that have plagued the pluralist West. And that's what I don't see happening through argument or through experiment or through science, either in a narrow or a broad sense, broad in the sense of rational inquiry. It just doesn't seem like it can work. James and I say in our response to your review, which again, I'll elaborate on a bit here. Philosophy is famous for entrenched disagreement. Philosophers are always disagreeing. Pick any issue. I mean, classical logic, seemingly the safest, most unexceptional, bedrock of just human rational inference. Plenty of philosophers will quibble with this or that. Oh, modus ponens is not a valid inference form, and here's why. So I think you can, through rational thought, inquiry, and through philosophy, come to know certain truths about morality and ethics. But the hard part is persuading other people. And Pinker's argument about I can't tell you to move just because I'm standing in this spot, or I forget his exact example. That's an argument that someone is only going to accept if they've already bought into certain background assumptions about the equality of human beings. Certain, I would say, broadly Enlightenment assumptions, which I think are correct, but historically not everyone has agreed with, and even today, not everyone agrees with. in other cultures at other times, someone might say, well, no, I don't have to move because I'm a Brahmin, or I don't know, like it's different for me than it is for you. We're not equal.
Let me amplify on that just for a minute. I don't disagree with Pinker that perhaps we are born. I believe we are, in fact, born with a rudimentary moral sense in the ways that Paul and I have been describing it, and I think you would agree. Where it comes from, that's a separate question, but I think we agree on that. The question then is moral authority. How do we adjudicate what constitutes a compelling reason for taking this action or that action? Is science enough of a moral authority to intervene in a dispute, in a conflict? It may be that we are able to develop a science of the good that will tell us what is right and wrong. Let's just imagine that. We don't believe that that's possible. But even if it were, is science enough of a moral authority to make it compelling to the disputants in a conflict? I don't think so. What is authoritative and what is not? What people find compelling and what people find trivial is something else, but it's also quite variable in human experience. So even if we could find
here, science is too narrow of a word. Maybe just a secular worldview or something like the idea of universal human rights that we've largely evolved to over the last century or so, in which more and more countries are liberal democracies, in which they grant all adults the franchise because everybody has to have a say in how they're governed. But if you drill down on that, it ends up being something about, well, in our nature, we're equal. I'm not special just because I'm me and you're not. Now, James, of course, correct. You're correct. Historically, people have often said, I am special because I'm a Brahmin or I'm a Muslim or I'm a Christian or whatever. That is the case. But that's been the whole pushback for the last couple centuries, is to say that that's not true. You're not special just because you're X. That everybody is equal by nature, not equal physically, intellectually, but under something like a universal human rights, whether they're natural rights or, Bentham famously said, rights are nonsense and natural rights are nonsense on stilts. It's just a social agreement. It's just by fiat, we're just saying it. Okay, wherever the source for the moment, let's set that aside. We seem to have kind of moved in that direction around the globe. Not all cultures, but most are moving in that direction. And the whole BLM Me Too movement now is, again, just another one of these kind of rising up saying, no, this is not right. We should be treated equally under the law and so forth. And so here I would appeal to your, the fact that religions before any kind of secular institutions discovered the golden rule and the silver rule and the platinum rule and, the variations on it, which are a version of that I'm not special. I have to take your perspective, call it the principle of interchangeable perspectives, as Pinker does. I have to put myself in your shoes to imagine how you would feel if I did this to you. If you did that to me, then I should not do that to you because this is how I would feel. It's not perfect, but something like, Rawls's, veil of ignorance. If we structure a society, I can't structure it in a way that I already know which group I'm going to be in. I have to structure it in a way that I don't know if I'm going to be born black or white, male or female, and so on. And, Spinoza's view from nowhere and the kind of Kantian universal principle of applying the rule to everybody. This idea, it seems to come up over and over and over, religions discovering it first with the golden rule, but even secular versions are kind of variations on that theme, which to me indicates that maybe it's like one of these Platonic truths that are really there. And we're all kind of discovering it as we go along, even though there are exceptions to that.
I think where I would go to try to figure out if that story is right, I'm not going to say it's not just, carte blanche, but to me, the confound that has to be ruled out is, did this kind of baseline moral view spread across the globe because it's so rationally intelligible, or did it spread because of which geopolitical powers endorsed it at the time in which they did? And this is not my area, but I think about a state like China. They're growing in strength relative to the U.S., and it's very unclear whether they accept the kind of Enlightenment picture of baseline morality you're describing. If you think about what they're doing to the Uyghur people in their West, it's not at all clear they've really bought in. And so I don't know. Has universal human rights, has it spread because of the just objective rationality of the view, or because certain world powers have endorsed it and other nations have had, non-moral incentives, non-rational incentives to toe the line?
Probably more of the latter.
That would take a book at least.
Probably more of the latter, because most of these things are not hashed out on podcasts like this, where eggheads talk about these things. But there's a third factor that is bottom up, that is just oppressed people standing up saying, we're not going to put up with this anymore. And now we have a basis for this. Look, we have this concept of rights. And we know that in the history of the rights movements, each of them build on the other ones. Women's rights built on the arguments that civil rights activists made, and gay rights activists built on the arguments that women's rights and civil rights activists used, and so forth. And so there is an intellectual basis to it, although it's more bottom up than that, I think.
Yeah, and I think we would share some of those views. I think there is an alternative reading of our contemporary moment, and that it's not evolving toward a kind of liberal democratic openness. There are certainly movements of liberation everywhere, but I see on the horizon the authoritarian temptation everywhere, and it's growing. It's not diminishing. Even in the United States, which is the longest-standing modern liberal democracy, we are in a culture war in which each side claims to be aggrieved. Each side accuses the other of being authoritarian, and quite frankly, each side oftentimes uses science to justify its moral and political claims against the other. How does science step into this in the kind of modest view of modest but rigorous view of the potential of science, step into conflicts that are as wide-ranging as the ones that constitute our culture war? I mean, that would be a question I'd ask you, Michael.
Yeah, well, I guess, again, I'm using the word in a much broader sense. I would make some of the arguments that philosophers make about, say, the nature of rights and why universal rights should be applied and where those come from. Kind of a reason or rationality-based arguments for why we should treat people this way or that way, even while recognizing that there are conflicting rights. So, for example, on the abortion issue, I think it's clear we have conflicting rights between the rights of the fetus to live and the rights of the mother to do what she wants with her body. And, and we can clearly see we're largely split on that one, almost 50-50 in the Western world, especially the United States. And also I make a distinction between different kinds of truths. This is a different project of mine, but maybe applicable here. I think there's certain truths we can all agree on that we can check for ourselves. These are more empirical, science-based truths, the Big Bang, evolutionary theory, climate change, whatever. But there are political truths that may have no basis in this. Like if I say, well, I believe in a progressive tax, and you say, well, I believe in a flat tax because flat tax is fair. And I say, no, a progressive tax is actually fairer because rich people can afford to pay more and so on. I'm not sure there's any experiment we're going to run to decide, well, which is the right answer to that, right? That's just, you just have your election and you get your guy in there and hope he changes the laws the way you want him to go. And then the other team's going to do the same thing in 4 years. And there's no ultimate correct answer there. Although, see, but that would be an example on your side. On my side, I would say something like, but on a bigger picture, maybe the difference between North Korea and South Korea clearly indicates that some governing systems and economic systems are objectively better. By objective, I mean measurable human flourishing, how much food you have to eat, how tall you are because of your crappy diets in North Korea, whose per capita GDP is an order of magnitude less than that in South Korea, and so on, and the freedoms they have, and compare East Germany to West Germany and why they had to build a wall, and so on. So that's kind of the low-hanging fruit that, that it's easy to go, yeah, that one's really better than this one. Not so clear on the abortion issue, maybe. Well, I was going to say, in a theistic worldview perspective, how do you think about those particular issues of moving universally towards some common set of rights, and where do those rights come from? How do you justify that? And as you know, I personally push back against not just the religious rights, divine command theory, but also a bigger concern of mine now is the left, or say the progressive left, the far left, the illiberal left, whichever word you want to use, who say, well, there is no right and wrong. There's no basis to morality. It's all culture. It's all relative. And who are we to say that women should not wear the burqa, or that this culture should not kill gay people? That's just a Western tradition. Okay, I assume maybe you have some pushback against that as well, but I don't actually know.
I think from my vantage point, the problem is that our public discourse tends to be locked in these binaries that are false to begin with. Take the abortion issue. You have the right to life versus the right to choose. I want to know what kind of society is it that creates that as a forced choice? To me, it's illegitimate. It's an illegitimate binary to begin with. We need the fundamental problem we have right now is not about rights. I mean, certainly rights are important. We need to pay attention to them. On the ground, they matter. But in the bigger picture, the problem is one of moral imagination. We can't imagine a future that is flourishing outside of a kind of technocratic framework. What about issues of beauty? I mean, we talk about justice, but to me, flourishing is not just about justice. It's also about beauty. It's about order. It's about a certain kind of prosperity that is shared. It is about the sustainable, not only in human life, but in the larger lived environment. And those things don't reduce to rights itself. The problem with our moral and political discourse is that it lacks imagination for a shared future.
To address your first point, I think because we have a legal system that says, well, you have to draw the line somewhere, and if we're going to have a law, the law says it's right there. It's black and white. Before the 20th week, it's okay to have an abortion. After 20 weeks, it's illegal. It's black and white because, again, it's like, when can you when can you vote? When can you start drinking alcohol? When can you drive a car? Well, it's right there. It's black and white. But of course, it's a continuum. But but lawyers and the justice system requires we have a black and white system for that.
But my view here is that law is an artifact of culture, and it's an artifact of moral culture. So what kind of society is it that makes us choose between, let's use the language of each side, the unborn child versus a young woman who's in trouble? An ethics of care, an ethics that is rooted in a larger vision of altruism is going to find ways to care for both. It doesn't mean that abortion disappears. or but its priority is going to be to try to care for all concerned here. It is about ethics of care, and our current legal environment, which again I think is derivative of our larger moral and political culture, is too truncated. We lack the moral imagination.
I think I would agree with that, because I don't think of it as an abortion issue. I think of it as an unwanted pregnancy issue. Well, why are women getting pregnant when they don't want to get pregnant? Well, okay, education, access to birth control, universal health care that pays for the birth control. And it's conservative Christians that have largely pushed back against that, saying, no, if we give them birth control, they're going to go and have sex, because it's always this kind of controlling women's reproductive choices has always been kind of what men do, and particularly religious men do over women. So here I'm kind of giving my own bias in that regard.
Slope.
Yeah. So I would agree with you, but then the solution, maybe, I don't know if you would agree with that or not, but yeah, just, educate people, and also economic empowerment. When women have more economic choices and power, they get pregnant less often and are less likely to have babies out of wedlock, something like that.
Yeah, Paul, what do you think?
I agree with your take, James.
Well, let's get back to the kind of the hard problem again of to what extent science can inform these things. So let's stop using that word. Just say reason, rationality, philosophy, whatever. Since you guys are professional philosophers, but you're also theists, then how do you kind of resolve the conflicts between, say, a Kantian deontological rule-based, rights-based versus a consequentialist utilitarian, we should do what's best for the greatest number, for the greatest good? Those are always in conflict, of course. But we seem to have evolved culturally in the Aristotle's virtue ethics, and then consequentialism, and then kind of rights or deontological base. Why we end up with three? And how come philosophers are so divided on this? I sent you that survey, and my listeners who heard the Dan Dennett debate with Greg Caruso will know I cited that. How come you guys can't get it straight and find consensus on free will and determinism? Or in this particular case, just to cite the numbers I sent you. Let's see, here it is. This was that 2009 survey of 3,200 philosophy professors and grad students, weigh in on 30 different subjects of concern. Meta-ethics, moral realism or moral anti-realism. So the moral realism was 56%, anti-realism 27%, 16% undecided or other. Moral judgment, cognitivism or non-cognitivism, that is, ethical statements can be true or false, 65% toward cognitivism, 17% toward other, and 17% non-cognitivism. And there was a couple more on that. Oh, the deontology versus consequentialism versus virtue ethics, that's really split. 32%, 25%, 24%, 18%. It's like, so my analogy here is in science, we usually end up with some kind of consensus. Like if we were still debating whether it was the Big Bang Theory or the steady state theory after 50 years or 100 years, people would go, all right, there's something wrong with your science here. Go figure out what's going on, because we need some consensus after a while. Yet after thousands of years, you professional philosophers can't seem to. So maybe because I'm not a philosopher, I'm just not getting how philosophy operates.
Well, I think it's a tough question. Why don't philosophers agree? I mean, I can hazard some speculative guesses. So from my perspective, part of the conflict between deciding between consequentialism and deontology is that, I'll just throw my own opinion into the mix. Aspects of both, to me, have to be correct. You can't be purely a consequentialist, in my opinion, because you wind up having to endorse situations where it's okay to take away someone's rights if enough people benefit. Classic thought experiments of this sort, which I don't. To me, those seem false. Not everyone agrees. Some philosophers will say no. Yes, sometimes. You gotta break a few eggs to get the omelet. And why do we disagree about those sorts of cases? Why do philosophers disagree? Part of it is this difference in subject matter that this sort of been just below the surface of our discussion all along, and that is there are parts of reality that you can directly experience, and we can sort of objectively or intersubjectively demonstrate, and that explains the agreement, the unanimity within parts of science. But not everything's like that. You mentioned some political questions. I think almost every aspect of first order morality or ethics are like that. But then you might wonder, well, why is it different than mathematics? Mathematics is not empirical, but there's a great deal of agreement in mathematics. And so there must be some difference between what is happening methodologically in philosophy and what's happening in mathematics. Neither are empirical. There's great agreement on one side. There's very little agreement on the other. And the best guess I can make is probably multiple factors, but one factor I think would be something like this. Philosophy is not very narrowly circumscribed. What you wind up, where you plant your flag in philosophy winds up ramifying out to all kinds of issues that really matter to you, to anyone who's thinking about them. And so it's a field full of landmines. Once you stake a claim on some fundamental philosophical question, which beliefs count as knowledge? What is the right way to acquire knowledge? Suddenly you wind up either committed or ruling out all kinds of other things that impinge on how you live and how society as a whole should live. And so it's fraught. And so it's difficult because of our cognitive biases, as theists we might say, because of something like sin, to just come at reality in a sort of open and accepting, let's just follow the arguments wherever they lead and see where they take us. Because you as a human being, you're likely coming into the discussion wanting certain things to be true. That doesn't mean we can never see things for how they are, but that is a big factor in doing philosophy.
And yet there's not there's not like 20 positions on these issues. There's maybe 2 or 3 or 4. So you guys have done some narrowing. There's some consensus.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm saying everyone's just seeing whatever they want to see, because that's not correct. And that part of the evidence is what you just pointed out. There's a recognition that, well, there's this phenomenon that we call duties, these deontological obligations that seem like they're plausibly genuine, and then now we have to decide if they really are. And the same for consequentialist reasoning and virtue theory. So there's enough of traction with the world of human experience to narrow it down. But then, well, which is right and to what degree? It gets murkier in a way that we have to recognize it's not really the case in math, for instance. That's not a great answer, but it's the perennial question: why isn't there progress in philosophy?
Well, I think there is progress, but you're not going to get where 97% of climate scientists say global warming is real and human caused. You're not going to get that on the free will determinism or this particular issue. I think just to put a flag on it for those that are not familiar with the terms and examples, we shouldn't lie. Lying is bad. Kant's universal, if everybody lied, it would be destructive to society. So we just universalize it, never lie. Okay, the Nazi comes to your door. Are you hiding any Jews in your basement? And you are. You should lie. Absolutely, you should lie. That'd be the right thing to do. And that has, the consequentialism, and then you throw rights in there, and the rights of people to be protected from oppression and so on. And that's where those conflicts arise.
I mean, you mentioned free will a minute ago. Oh, sorry, James.
Well, I was just going to say that I view the problem a little bit differently. I think that the more as a prism into the nature of the modern Enlightenment project. It was a quest for certainty. The project, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment that followed, constituted an intellectual revolution, and ultimately a cultural revolution, the origins of which was a longing for certainty in a world without certainty, in a world that was changing and transforming, and the good intentions of so many people to get it right, to build something, And yet the modern quest for rational and scientific, broadly defined scientific certainty has left us with more questions, not fewer questions, with perhaps less certainty than more certainty. And it's not that we haven't made progress here and there, but that progress is disputed by so many people. Science itself, there are fields that are committed to the deconstruction of science and scientific fact and so on. So in a way, it's a prism into the nature of the modern project itself. And the survey, what I found interesting about the survey were the number of people who checked other to some of these questions.
Right. Yes. We don't know what that is. Yeah.
These are really significant, large numbers of people. So at the end of the quest for certainty, we end up with uncertainty in so many ways. And philosophers reflect that in the diversity of their opinion.
Paul, you mentioned the word sin. What do theist philosophers like yourselves think of as sin? What does that mean?
Oh, unsurprisingly, there's no agreement. Well, I was trying to think of a moral analog term that pairs with theism. I didn't have some kind of heavyweight theoretical notion of mind. But going back just a minute, on the question of disagreement, I think here's an example that could help illuminate what I'm trying to say about the disagreement a little more. So one of our disagreements in this conversation, Michael, has been how to deal with moral phenomena in terms of giving an explanation for it. And don't let me read a view onto you that's not yours. Feel free to push back. But my nutshell take is something like you want the explanation to be naturalistic, something that maybe not completely, but ideally it would be in terms of mechanistic interactions or Newtonian lawful interactions, things that are of a piece with the kinds of explanations we have in science and in most of biology and in most of physics. And that's a common desire or demand to place on an explanatory view of the world. And that's I think, in my opinion, the root of the naturalists' request, make reality turn out to be explicable in a certain kind of way. On the other side are people like myself who I start in a different place. I try to delve into the phenomenon of morality and ethics as much as I can. And I think I've understood it well. And what I believe I've understood is something that can't be explained in this sort of mechanistic or empirical way. And so, this kind of fault line winds up reappearing in all kinds of places within philosophy, not on the ethical theory view you just talked about, but this same divide, I think, is the root of the debate about free will. Libertarians about free will are open to there being this strange, irreducible phenomenon called will. And usually it's naturalists on the other side who are determinists or think it's just chaos and would say, no, whatever free will is, if it is a thing, it has to obey lawful, sort of scientific picture of the world, causal principles. And so it's this big picture of reality debate that lurks behind so many questions in philosophy today. It was probably a different debate earlier times, but today that's the big question. And so many of these disagreements are sort of proxy disagreements for the big one, naturalism or spookier stuff.
Now, I'd also like to push back against what I think is an ultimately unhelpful binary between naturalism and theism, as though if you're a naturalist, you can't be a theist. If you're a theist, you can't be a naturalist. Let me give you an example. In the social sciences, there are a number of different theories about the nature of God. These are all naturalist theories. Probably the most important one is the one offered by Emil Durkheim, who argues in his attempt to make sense of why there is a God in every society. How do we account for that? And Durkheim's response is that God is a symbolic projection of the collective values and traits of that society. So when a society is worshiping its God, it's essentially worshiping itself. the things that it holds sacred, the things that it holds most dear. The Freudian analog to that is that God is a symbolic projection of the father figure. In the case of Marx, God is simply, and heaven and the celestial realm is a symbolic projection of all those things that are denied under capitalism. These are naturalist explanations for the existence of God. And as a theist, I have no problem with any of those. They are empirical questions. They can be explored. Here's my problem. I have problems with them if they are the exclusive answer. To say that God is a symbolic projection of a society's collective values and traits isn't to say that God is only that. And for someone to say that essentially answers the question, there's nothing else to say about it, is in fact a theological statement. It is a presupposition that can neither be proven right nor wrong. So to say that God is a projection of all those needs denied under capitalism may be true, but it's not to say that God isn't more than that as well. We just don't have the empirical tools to get at that other thing.
Well, then, but how would you ever get at it? And then what's the justification for belief in it?
Well, this is why they call it faith. And the whole point of the work of someone like Michael Polanyi is the argument that even science itself is rooted in certain kinds of fiduciary assumptions that simply can't be proven correct or incorrect.
Fiduciary? Okay. Interesting choice of words.
Well,
I think I'm following you, but just again leave the word science out and just say, and maybe even naturalism. How do I get out of my head and to know if it's not, I'm just not totally deluded in thinking that I think X is real, and because I got confirmation from you because you looked at it too and you saw it and you saw it and something like that. That just build reliable knowledge. And admittedly, there are internal truths versus external truths. If I say, these are my examples I use, if I say dark chocolate's better than milk chocolate, and you go, no, milk chocolate's better than dark chocolate. Or I say Stairway to Heaven is the best song ever, and you go, no, Freebird or whoever is a much better song than Stairway to whatever. Those are just tastes or preferences, not really objective truths at all. But now just kind of scaling up from that, if I say someone named Jesus of Nazareth probably really existed, which I do, and he was probably crucified because the Romans crucified everybody for petty thieves, and so on. And most philosophers and historians of religion that I know who are atheists, even they will agree to those 2 points. Now, did he die for your sins? Okay, there is no purchase we're going to ever get on reliable empirical knowledge or anything like that. That's just a statement of faith. Was he resurrected from the dead? Okay, that's kind of in between those, right? I mean, it's not impossible, but it's pretty improbable. 100 billion people have lived and died before us. Not one of them's come back from the dead, except maybe one if you're a Christian. What's the evidence for that? So now you see where I'm going. It's like making that transition from an internal subjective faith-based to something we can agree on.
Yeah, no, I think you've put the dilemma extremely well. I think that one can't empirically demonstrate or even rationally demonstrate that God exists. But you can't empirically demonstrate that God doesn't exist either.
Can't prove a negative, you mean?
Yeah, right.
Well, if by demonstrate, James, you mean, provide evidence for which, at least most people would accept. I agree. To me, rational basis for belief in God is like so many of the other philosophical questions. I think there are good arguments, but there are plenty of people who disagree about them. And I guess I think I love that there are some questions we can resolve through intersubjectively verifiable empirical demonstration. It's nice to be able to agree on some things, but just maybe it's a tragedy, maybe it's sad, but it just seems like a fact. So much isn't like that. But we can't withhold belief and say, well, I'm just going to be an agnostic about everything that's not scientifically decidable, because too much falls into that basket. It's so much of everything that we take ourselves to know.
Yeah, you can be agnostic. It's okay to just say I don't know, but
some things,
yeah,
but not.
Okay, all right. Like,
so here's
why does God have to be in that basket? I mean, I could see maybe free will, because I feel like I'm free. I have to. Society has to hold people accountable, so we're all going to agree, even if it's a fiction, it's a useful fiction. So we'll just say it's true, whether it is or not. And you would put God in that category?
No, I think it's so. I think your point. If your point is, can one be agnostic about God or free will? I totally agree. Sure. I mean, the case you just gave. How do you get in the specific question about one particular religion, Orthodox Christianity or something? How do you get beyond these two pretty minimal historical pieces of evidence to this full-blown religion? That's a much harder question. But my point was, I worry sometimes that we set our standards too high for justifiable belief. Science is the gold standard, but it's okay to buy things when you don't even have any gold. We can. There's so many things that I think we can legitimately know that we can't demonstrate scientifically, and even when others disagree, there are lots of examples of this. But I take your point. That doesn't mean you have to. Plenty of times we'll be in cases where we just don't know how to crunch the numbers.
Yeah. Well, this would be a kind of a pragmatism perspective. I'll tell you a little story that some of my listeners will have already heard. Martin Gardner is one of the founders of the modern skeptical movement. He was a longtime Scientific American columnist before I was, and a hero amongst most, atheists and skeptics. But he believed in God. He called it Fideism, and he got this from William James and Miguel Unamuno, philosopher, that under certain circumstances, if it cannot be determined empirically or any kind of rational arguments or whatever, and it's important to you personally, and there's no harm done, it's okay to believe it. He put free will in that issue and also the existence of God. And he even said, I think the atheists have slightly better arguments than the theists, although, the theists have good arguments and then the counter arguments, and they go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And the atheists have slightly better, but I'm just going to believe because it works for me. At some point, you can make that, well, call it a leap of faith, I guess, sort of a Kierkegaardian, into the abyss just because.
Yeah, maybe that's right. I guess I tend to think that the rational case is a little better than that. I mean, for me personally, what I find compelling is the evident beauty in nature. It's just far beyond what is required for any life form. What is sort of required at a bare level for a species to compete, reproduce, survive? It doesn't have to involve. I mean, just take color, for instance. It doesn't have to involve this amazing array of colors. You catch a pumpkin seed sunfish. It doesn't have to be these brilliant shades of turquoise and red. And just so much about the natural world is like this. It's gratuitously beautiful in a way that there really isn't a good naturalist explanation for, in my opinion.
Although Darwin countered that with the problem of evil in nature, not just human evil, but nature's pretty cruel. There's just a lot of death and suffering, and I mean, it is nasty. It's not beautiful in that in the kind of physical sense of flourishing. It's actually quite the opposite. And like the fine-tune argument, well, most of the universe is not fine-tuned for human existence. In fact, we probably maybe will never live anywhere else other than Earth. Some people say, because it's so harsh. So maybe that, I don't know if that's I'm not sure what you mean by beauty. Because different species see different things. So, a sunset's not going to look like it does to us to a bat or a dolphin or something like that.
True. I think that the best response to this sort of argument that I'm giving is to back off from our access to objective beauty. And if you're willing to say, I just think it's beautiful, but I'm not really accessing something objectively real about the world. That's the only sensible. Is it sensible? It's the only coherent way out of the argument, in my opinion. But I think you have to give up a lot. For me, if when I look at the sunset sometimes, or I look at even the birds on my bird feeder, the goldfinches, the downy woodpeckers, they're so striking. It's sure, these patterns and colors did, as a contingent matter of fact, play a role in natural selection, but they didn't have to. It all could have been done with ones and zeros or little nondescript symbols. It didn't have. It's just the beauty is just so gratuitous, above and beyond what's required for the purely naturally selective naturalist story, that I find it hard to think that there wasn't an intelligence behind it. But again, so this is a modest theistic argument that I personally find convincing. But if you're willing to sacrifice the objectivity of beauty, you can get out of it, certainly.
I take the naturalist account of or argument for God that you outlined, Michael, as an okay starting point. I'm intrigued, Paul, by what you said. I want to talk further with you about that. But yeah, maybe in our next book. But
but what I'm asking, maybe go ahead, James. Yeah.
Let me just say this, if I could, that part of my own understanding of sort of the rudimentary moral nature of human beings is that we are narrative creatures. We are fundamentally narrative creatures. We define our identity, our purposes through story, and I think that is probably, though I haven't done the work myself, perhaps Donald Brown has, but my guess is that is a human universal. And the question
that's right.
The question then is, what provides the best account of a human life? What provides the best account of our relationship with others? What provides the best account for how communities survive or disintegrate? Science, narrowly defined, rationalism, or naturalism, even more broadly defined, provides a good account, provides a big part of the larger story. I'm not sure it provides everything that we need or everything that makes an account satisfying. And I think it is because of what I believe are the inadequacies of naturalism that also lead to, at least to the edge of theism. It doesn't move one into theism, but the inadequacies of the account, at least as I see it, move one at least to the edge.
There are naturalists who would agree with you that we have a problem with telling our story. So we admire people like Carl Sagan because his Cosmos series on PBS, rebooted by Neil deGrasse Tyson, just as powerfully, was conveying kind of the spirituality, the awe and wonder, the beauty of this scientific worldview. You can give the facts, but you got to layer onto that something more. And so there are naturalists that want to almost build a naturalistic religion. And even within atheist circles, there's some people that say, well, we need to have like the equivalent of a church in every city where atheists can go to get married and get buried and have rites of passage and so on. As if that we have some kind of impulse within us that we need something like religion. Religion is such a big word and so loaded, whatever you want to call it. Some social institution that's not just fact-based, it's something else. And I think that's what you're getting at. I'm still not sure why. So technically agnostic, when Huxley coined that word in 1869, he just meant it's not knowable. There's no set of arguments or empirical experiments we're going to run and say, yep, there it is, or nope, there's no God, whatever. We just can't know. And I think that's what you're arguing. So then the question is do you do like what I do, which is nothing? I just say, okay, well, there's probably no God. Maybe there is. I'll be happy to be pleasantly surprised when I get to the next side, hopefully, if that happens. But if not, well, okay. I still think we should lead a moral life and so on. And then you build from there something like an Enlightenment humanism that's rights-based, and you end up down the philosophy hole that you guys know, with consequentialism and rules and rights and whatnot. Okay, so or you do what maybe I'm assuming you guys have done. You've thrown your hat into no one knows for sure, so I'm going with that. I think there is a God. But from there, do you not then have to decide, well, which religion are we going to follow based on our conception of God? And then you have rules and customs that go along with the religion, and all of a sudden you're practicing something. You're not just in an ivory tower thinking about it. You're actually doing something.
Well, I mean, that's a huge question. So is the question sort of, let's say you tipped over the line and you're okay with some kind of deity, but now, which way of making peace with that deity do you need to take? I don't know. I mean, there's so much. It's such a huge question. I mean, you'd have to know something about the religions.
Let me just be blunt. What religion do you follow, if you follow any?
I'm a Christian. I mean, I guess my response personally to that would be something like, for me, and I think for most specific practitioners or practitioners of specific religions, there are so many factors that are built into it. Some of it is purely contingent, historical. For most people, it's, well, you were born into a society that was predominantly following, practicing this religion. Your parents did, so most likely you do too. That's not determinative, because there are all kinds of stories about people who started one and go another way. I think maybe you did that just from reading your Wikipedia page, Michael.
Something like that, yeah.
There's also personal experiences. Religious people say weird things like, well, this happened to me and it changed my view on things. And everybody says that. From each religion, there are people who say, well, I had this encounter, I had this experience. And so I think to some degree you're kind of reacting to the experiences that you have. You can't help but be situated in the cultural and historical moment that you are. And so I think, from my perspective, a lot of the decision goes down to those factors.
James, what are you a Christian? Do you belong to a denomination, or?
I don't belong to a denomination. I am a Christian theist, although, as one of my close friends has put it, probably 97% of most Christians would disagree with my take on things. Yeah, and I'm not one to talk publicly about these kinds of things. I'm a pacifist, but I've been influenced by a number of different traditions. But I was also raised in the tradition that makes a very big difference, as Paul suggested. But I also find that it provides the best account for me. I don't find, to sort of reinforce a point I made earlier, I don't find that my commitments to Christian theism in any way gets in the way of the kind of philosophical or social scientific or social philosophy that is rigorously naturalistic. And Francis Collins, for example, is a very, very good scientist, but he's also a theist as well.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah. I have a chapter on Francis in my book, The Believing Brain. I interviewed him. I've met him several times. Super great guy. Yeah. And
he's amazing.
And he largely agrees with me that the arguments I'm making, that he likes this argument from an evolutionary perspective for this is how God did it. You don't have to give that part up. If you follow the laws of nature and how they cash out into actual actions of humans and thoughts and so on, and moral values and whatnot, you can still say, well, this is how God did it. And that's what he does say. Now, there's a little leap there. I don't make that leap. He does. and maybe there's no quite right answer there. But to get back to where we started the whole conversation, there's common ground. Yes, almost 2 hours ago, where we started the conversation on moral values. So once you've committed to, say, Christianity, this cashes out into kind of a set of values that we Christians hold. Like, we're pro-life. We have this opinion on immigration and gun control law, and we have these economic policies and so on. How do you guys, since you're professional philosophers, you're not just going along with whatever the pastor or the president says we're supposed to believe, how do you kind of deal with those controversial issues that are so divisive and split, where it's not clear what the right answer is, with what your religion tends to go toward?
Well, let me start off, Paul. You can jump in at any point. My sense is that, and here I think, Michael, you and I may disagree about our contemporary moment, how to characterize it. I think we live in a moment of a kind of, in our public culture, and I would make a distinction between public and private. Our private cultures tend to be far more pluralistic, but our public culture, which tends to be, again, fairly binary, in part because our public culture has become so politicized. My sense is that we are living in a moment of a kind of creeping nihilism, and I think it's reinforced by not only our political discourse, which is fear-based, negational in character. I think it is reinforced by a consumer culture that's highly materialist, an entertainment culture which is committed. Its highest goods, it seemed to me, are titillation. It's not that you can't find good things in popular culture. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but my sense is that our public culture is increasingly nihilistic in its various dimensions. And my sense is that Christianity in America, again, in its public engagement, in the public culture that it manifests, is part and parcel of it. In fact, it has helped to create or reinforce some of that nihilism. In our political culture, it is played along with what Nietzsche called ressentiment, and its moral logics of narratives of injury, which only lead to one end, which is revenge. So you can see why there are many Christians who might find my position objectionable, but I think that so much of what passes as public Christianity, in fact, owes more to Nietzsche than it does to Christ.
Interesting. Wow. Okay.
That's how I would.
Yeah, that's pretty. I'm not sure how I would respond to that, but before I do, Paul.
Oh, I think that's well put, James. I certainly don't feel any need to go along part and parcel with whatever, as if there even were a unified thing called Christianity. There's many denominations and sects, but even within a given denomination, the church that I attend, I don't feel an obligation to agree with what is being said. I think there is a traditional, historic core to Christian orthodoxy and practice that I do accept and think is correctly grounded in the Christian Bible and supported by philosophy and just rational inquiry into the world. But because of a lot of the political factors that James has mentioned, it's pretty fraught to say, I think our society should be thus and so because of my personal religious beliefs. I think that, at least for me, who's not, I don't study politics. I don't spend a great deal of time thinking about it. being a Christian is about loving my neighbor and the people that I happen to know in my church, out of my church, in my actual neighborhood, my friends, and following, traditional Christian ethics in that sense. So that's something that hopefully all Christians agree with. And in terms of the broader political landscape, it's harder for me to know. And James's depressing diagnosis seems to be largely correct.
I don't know. I have to say I'm conflicted about that. I have those worries that you have, James, that you everything you brought up there. The divisiveness, the illiberalism on the left, and the and the sort of crazy loony right stuff, all that. But I can't tell if it's a blip in the long moral arc, just maybe a 10, 20-year dip in the rise of authoritarianism and populism and so on, or if it's a long-term trend that we should be concerned about. But let me just, because I mentioned cashing out your religious beliefs, to what extent your religion informs your opinion on these moral issues that we've been talking about. Let's just take abortion. Now, I don't mean personally. I'm pro-choice, but I personally would not, go along with my wife having an abortion. I think we personally say no, we're morally against that. But I mean publicly, I don't feel like I want to tell women what they can and shouldn't do with their body. So I go on that side. Are you guys pro-life? And if so, why? Or what is your position and why? Either one of you.
Again, I want to resist the binary. I think the law is what it is right now, and again, the larger backdrop of my view is that we are in a situation where all of life, not just unborn human life, but all of life is not regarded as sacred as it is, or it should be viewed. But James,
come on, we're having epic battles over Supreme Court justices that just play out as just these monumental fights, and we all know why, because of Roe v. Wade. Christians want to overturn Roe v. Wade, so it is binary.
Well, I think our public policy and our law is binary. That's true. And but that's part of the reason why the more I learn, the more I study, the more I understand about our culture and our politics, the less politicized I am, because I don't believe that politics has the answer to most of the problems that we face today. I think we look to politics and expect way too much from it, and when in fact politicizing many of these highly contentious issues just leads us to a cul-de-sac, and it's a game I just don't want to play. I want to look for alternatives.
I would say, Michael, I think that the right answer is you should love your neighbor. And so what that means is several things. I think it does mean you should love your unborn neighbors. And I think that means not letting them be killed. But it also means you love your neighbors who are put in the difficult position of having to make that decision. So often if you ask somebody, are you pro-choice or pro-life? They answer the question by saying one of those two sentences, and you immediately assume all kinds of other things about their view. And that's what I want to avoid. I think it's not enough to say I'm pro-life, we shouldn't kill unborn human persons or whatever, and then stop there. That's not loving. It's sort of meeting a minimal obligation to future persons, but it's ignoring at least half of the overall social problem. So I think, if people are going to say they're pro-life, they have to at the same time make a concerted effort to love their neighbor in every way. Support adoption of unwanted children, for instance. Work to address the underlying causes of unwanted pregnancy, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so I like that, Paul, and I would say offer a historical example. I'll even say, thank God, we live at a moment in which slavery is unimaginable. The slavery of African Americans is unimaginable to us. This is a moral achievement. This is a good. We need to get to a place where the termination of unborn life and the dilemmas, the wrenching dilemmas of young women in trouble is unimaginable. Can we imagine something like that? And if we can imagine it, how do we get there? That's the game I would like to play. That's the argument. That's the conversation that I think is worth having. Otherwise, we're just going back and forth. And I think, after all of these years, after Roe v. Wade, it's pretty clear, while the law and policy has changed, and while the machinations of state versus federal government interventions in this question continue to evolve, the debate hasn't evolved at all. I don't think we're much further than we were 40 some years ago. That troubles.
Yes, well, gentlemen, we've been going 2 hours. Well done. We covered, I think, most of the major points in your book, which is where we started. I had no idea the conversation was going to take a turn to this. To me,
plenty of major ones not on our book. Yeah.
Now I've given you 2 more books you can write together, and we can have you back on the podcast to discuss those, because really these are the ultimate biggest questions of all that clearly are not obviously resolvable through science alone or religion alone or maybe even philosophy alone. Again, the whole suite of human cognitive tools we have to put to it. And anyway, so I thank you for your time and your thoughts. Is there anything else we've left off that you want to comment on, or?
I don't think so. I think we ran the full gamut, Michael. Thank you for the chance to talk with you. It's I didn't know it had been 2 hours. Time is flying by.
Oh yeah, flying by. This is what happens when you get deep into the weeds.
I'm grateful for the opportunity, and Paul, you and I have to continue talking.
That's right. You guys stay on and start writing your next book while I get off here.
All right,
gentlemen. Thank you so much.